Hi, we've never met, but my name is Nishubi. I am in
Nice.
Greece. And right now we're at Building 21 with a bunch of researchers, scholars, staring questions about psychedelics, about the self, about daydreams and dreams. So since you have some background on it, we thought we could talk to you a little. Um, so I guess since I'm interested in self, I first wanted to hear your definition of what the self is versus ego versus ego dissolution versus non-self. Is that too much?
Uh, yeah, for sure. I could share like my own thoughts on this. So, um, so you want can you repeat that? Sorry, the audio is a bit echoey on my end.
Maybe much closer to the speaker, it's gonna really, focus on you and the whole business.
Yeah, you're really smart.
I guess so for example, my research question is interested in looking at the self in processes of ego dissolution, like after psychedelics, or also the concept of non-self in meditation. So how would you define self versus ego, and also what ego dissolution is versus non-self? Like, what are the differences?
Yeah, for sure. For me, well, how it's usually characterized in psychedelic research when we talk about the ego, it's often seen as a mixture of two different types of self, right? There's like two primary kinds of self. Like there's the narrative self, which is kind of the sense of self rooted in our autobiographical memories, and it's kind of like our conceptual narratives that we have about who we are as somebody that's embedded in time, right? So it's like we're this person with these characteristics that has this past and has this future imagined ahead of it. And so there's that kind of conceptual self of identity. And then kind of more fundamental, there's like what's called the minimal self or the embodied self, which is just our sense of one inhabiting a particular first person perspective on the world and kind of being located here spatially. Like I end where my skin ends and I'm located here. And so you can see how our sense of self typically involves both these things, right? Like we feel like we have a body, we're located here, and then we also have this identity rooted in time and concepts and our self-narrative and so on. And so when ego dissolution is measured in the context of psychedelic research, the measures that are used implicitly seem to be relating to those kinds of self. Because on one side, there's things related to having a blurred sense of our bodily boundaries, which corresponds to that second sense of self I just described, which is the embodied minimal self. Just like, people have experiences of merging with the couch that they're sitting on, or with other objects, or with other people, and just that basic bodily boundary will be disturbed. And then simultaneously, often they'll also, in a sense, forget who they are conceptually and like lose identification with their conceptual self, rooted in concepts and in memories. And so that's kind of how I would describe how the self is construed in psychedelic research and what's usually meant by ego dissolution. And I mean, for me, I find a lot of the measures of ego dissolution that are commonly used in the psychedelic space to be a bit limited, mainly because they don't explicitly separate these two types of self and often just use, vaguely worded items such as, rate from 1 to 7 on how much your sense of self dissolved or it was less concrete, or whether your concerns about yourself were reduced, and kind of these vague questions which can be interpreted in a variety of ways and which don't clearly correspond to other types of self that have been characterized in literature. So I see limitations there, but overall I would say that's how it's conceptualized, and I think yeah, drawing the relationship between that and stuff outside of psychedelics and alterations related to meditation and other practices. I do think there's often ambiguity again in corresponding to whether we're referring primarily to bodily changes in our sense of self or these conceptual ones. And so it's often very vaguely defined in general. But my hunch is that, in these experiences of no self, similar to the ego dissolution, there is a conceptual component and then there's a bodily component. And both potentially can happen independently, but when we think of no self or ego dissolution, it's both those things kind of going away temporarily.
Also, anyone can chime in with questions or whatever. Doesn't want to.
Please continue. Speak to the album.
Okay. So in that case, you mentioned the research currently uses vague measures. What would be your suggestions for other potential methods of studying ego dissolution?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, what I would like to see is measures which are more rooted in actual psychological constructs that exist in literature. I just mentioned, the minimal embodied self versus autobiographical / narrative self. If we kind of took those different components of self and others potentially as a starting point and then created measures, questionnaires based on those, which distinguish these different types of self, I think that would lead to characterizations that could be more useful for finding, biological correlates, but also clarify what exactly we're talking about. And there's this researcher named Anne Taves. She's a humanities researcher. She had a really good paper. The title is something along the lines of, like refining measures of self-experience. And what was interesting about what she did, she got a bunch of questions found in the ego dissolution inventory, in the mystical experience questionnaire, and these different ways of indexing these kinds of phenomena, and actually asked participants to paraphrase each item and kind of explain how they understood it. And she saw that like several of them were quite ambiguous. People interpret them in their own way, and she used that to try to construct, kind of try to reword these items to create alternative versions of them that kind of are more likely to be interpreted in a consistent way. And so I think that kind of work is super important of actually, finding out how are these measures interpreted and how can we refine them to make them more valid and, to ensure everyone's answering them in the right way and interpreting it in similar ways. And also in her work, she looked at cross-cultural differences too, which is important because I think in hers, she had a sample of people. She had an English version, and then I think she might have had like a Hindi version and another version, and she was trying to see how different cultures, especially those who intersect with kind of spiritual concepts, how they interpret these items. And so I think combination of that, of refining it and getting feedback on how people interpret it, and then grounding them in existing psychological constructs, I think those two combined will allow us to get more nuanced understandings, and that could more likely allow us to relate it to biology, like using neuroimaging or things like that as well.
So your research has looked at biological correlates, right? So then when you describe ego dissolution as consisting of a blurred sense of bodily boundaries and impacting autobiographical memories, I have a neuroscience background, so how would that impact, for example, hippocampal retrieval of memories? And are these transient experiences? Like, what does the brain dynamics look like?
Right. Yeah. One thing I should say is like consistent, I guess, with what I'm describing, the work linking ego dissolution induced by psychedelic to the brain hasn't really been that consistent across studies. Like some studies have found, reduced integration within the default mode network is associated with it. Some studies just haven't found that. Some studies have emphasized other regions. And so, for example, you get the default mode network stuff, and another study actually found stuff in the insula and the temporoparietal junction, which are two areas in the brain related to our body image and kind of integration of sensory signals and bodily signals. And so, and that's more consistent with the bodily and minimal self. And so I think with the existing measures, again, since they're kind of vague and agnostic to these different aspects of self, when we look at the correlates, it's going to be a mixture of both these different types of self, and it's going to be hard to kind of separate them out. And so because of that, you're going to get inconsistent findings, and it's going to be harder to find consensus overall, just because, again, the measures we're correlating are very complex and include different components of self. And so I think, you know, the stuff related to hippocampus and memory retrieval, and, you know, it also has been found in the past, like parahippocampus connectivity with other areas. I personally think that's more related to the narrative conceptual self and that going away in a psychedelic experience. But again, our measures of ego dissolution don't dissociate that from the other type of self. And so it gets all kind of jumbled together and messy. So yeah, this is why I think, you know, no scientist, I think, would say we have a reliable understanding of how ego dissolution looks in the brain as induced by a psychedelic. It's just too messy and inconsistent right now.
I had a sort of idea about the self recently that I was thinking about, that to some extent, I feel like the self can be defined in terms of like how you perceive like your interactions with the world. Like the self can almost be defined externally really well, and like how you understand your place in the world and how you understand like your physical body and the space you take up in the world and how others perceive you and like the image of you. And so then if we could have this sort of external conception of the self, then maybe could that be another way to like have different measures of the self that use more of like the psychological standards that we're used to, like things like questionnaires about like your perception of the world in like a physical sense, but then also your perception of like your social interactions and your perception of like how people see you. Like, is there anything that's been done on like looking at the self kind of from an outside perspective and like in terms of how you interact with the world?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think there is research starting to be done along those lines. It's often construed as your self-beliefs, like your beliefs about yourself, which are often very related to how you perceive others perceive you, right? And your perception of the world as well. And for example, there's a lab at Stanford actually. The researcher, the lead researcher, is Dr. James Gross, who's very well known in kind of emotional neuroscience. He's like, you know, one of the legends in the field. And they're looking at, how do beliefs about ourselves, which are often, again, socially based, how do they kind of influence our emotional reactions to things, how we perceive things, and how do they relate to different disorders, like such as depression or generalized anxiety disorder and these kinds of things. And so I think, you know, there is a movement towards looking at that too. And that's actually something I want to look at in the future personally, is like, how can we best understand the beliefs we have about ourselves? And how does that relate to, again, our perception of the world, our emotional responses, our interpretations of things? I think that all these things are often, you know, altered by psychedelics after the experience and during. And so I think, it is super interesting in a different aspect of it. And I think also, goes hand in hand with the autobiographical / narrative self I was describing.
I guess, so there's a lot of messy correlative data. Have there been attempts at looking at the self in animal data or manipulating, say, the default mode network activity and saying, no, how does that affect?
Yeah, totally. It's hard to study, right? Because the self is such like a high level thing, and it's hard to determine, you know, the experience of an animal and what their sense of self is, and whether they have these more elaborate conceptual selves or not, because that might be something that's unique to humans, given the fact that the areas in the deep mode network, for example, and these memory areas are kind of much more expanded in humans relative to other animals, other primates and things. And so it's hard to determine what aspects of self are unique to humans. And again, I think, I'm not sure if we can assume other animals have a ongoing self-narrative about who they are or something like this. I mean, they definitely have bodily sense of selves. They know that they're distinct from their environment and that they have a body and that they're located at a particular place in space, but it's hard to know other types of self. And it's not like we can ask them to report on their experience, right? So it gets really tricky. And also the default mode network in general is involved in so many processes. So it's not like, we can assume that disrupting activity in there is associated with just a sense of self, because it could be associated with a whole variety of things. And again, back to my first point is that even the default mode network and its organization and the extent to which it's present in other animals is much less than humans, because it kind of developed and expanded default mode network is the hallmark of a human brain, and it's not really found in other species to the extent that it is in humans. So it makes it really hard to make comparisons to other animals.
Oh, do you mind? Manesh, my name's Javed. I kind of work here. No, it's really lovely to have you here. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about your current research, because I saw a 2022 paper about dimensionality reduction on modular hierarchical something.
Yeah.
Can you expand on that and bring it to, because I didn't read it. I skimmed the abstract while we were talking. So could you give us a synopsis and give us a sense of what your research is investigating and how it's taking place and what motivates it and what excites you about it?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So that paper, I'll start with that paper. Well, I'll actually, this background in general, what I'm interested in personally is understanding more of the mechanisms of how psychedelics affect the brain in the way they do and why that can be therapeutic, and kind of at the brain level, but also psychological level, how this is happening. And so with that paper that you mentioned, I was analyzing data of people who are on LSD and psilocybin, like acute fMRI data. And I was trying to test a hypothesis that relates to the rebus model, if you guys are familiar with that, which is a model of how psychedelics work, basically proposed by Robin Carhart-Harris, who's a leading psychedelic researcher and someone, I published that paper with him, and I work with Robin closely. So what that model is in a nutshell, like it's a lot to go into, but in a nutshell, it's like the idea that psychedelics induce their characteristic effects by reducing kind of the hold that our beliefs and narratives have on our experience, and kind of allowing us to be in a place where our beliefs and assumptions about the world are made a bit less rigid, and we're more open to incoming sources of information to change our beliefs. And so it's kind of this mental flexibility as pertains to our beliefs about ourselves, about the world. And one hypothesis from that is that these high-level areas which relate to our beliefs and so on become less distinct from the parts of our brain related to sensory inputs. So like incoming information is less distinct from our internal beliefs and models. And with the idea again that our beliefs and models become more malleable and more kind of responsive to feedback and information. And so in that study, I was applying some analyses to the data to see to what extent that these higher level areas in the default mode network and other areas are less differentiated, are less distinct from sensory areas. And how we conceptualized it in there is like using this technique, we're able to kind of characterize the brain in terms of this hierarchy from sensory areas, which are like, connected to our senses, involved in concrete perception. There's a hierarchy from those regions all the way up to the default mode network, which is more abstract and memory based. And so in that paper, I showed how that these kind of opposite ends of the hierarchy become less differentiated from each other. There's a lot more connectivity between them, and this hierarchy is kind of compressed, and which is consistent with the model showing that our bottom-up experience of the world is more interconnected with our beliefs. And so, yeah, basically with that paper, I was testing that hypothesis of the rebus model, and found some, some brain effects consistent with what the model would expect. Yeah, so that was that paper, and I think, moving forward, I'm actually joining Robin Carhart-Harris, who again was he came up with that model, and he was kind of the senior author on that paper. He's currently at the University of California, San Francisco, and so I'm joining him after my PhD. So I'm joining him in August to do more psychedelic neuroimaging research with him, and I'm actually going to do something related to what we've been discussing. And what came up is this kind of what I'm really interested in is how can we in more depth characterize changes to our sense of self that happen after an experience? Because often when people have a profound experience in a clinical setting with psilocybin, let's say, they'll say things like, I have a new perspective on the world and myself. I see my relationships differently. What I see as possible for myself has changed, or maybe I see myself with more self-love, or I see how my beliefs had been limiting me. And there's some evidence too, more recently, that our negative beliefs about ourselves become less negative after an experience. And so what I want to do is characterize that in more detail and see how that relates to how our brain processes information using neuroimaging. And so I'll be looking at, how do self-related beliefs change, and how does that relate to our processing of social information and other types of information as well. That's kind of what I move into, because I find that super interesting, and I feel like that's critical to therapeutic effects. Yeah.
That's super exciting. Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
For sure.
I have a related question to what you were just saying. Do you have any idea, is there any research on how long these effects last? Like you mentioned, there being, after an experience with psychedelics, having fewer negative, or the negative thoughts were less negative. Do we know how long those effects last, or is that still under study?
Yeah, I think the study I was referring to specifically was looking, I think, might have been either 1 week. Usually the studies are looking at up to around 6 weeks post-treatment as the main endpoint. And so I think the study I was referring to might have been 6 weeks, or it might have been earlier at 1 week. But I think there is evidence of therapeutic benefits lasting up to a year. They do a follow-up after 12 months, and still a good proportion of the participants or patients have significantly reduced depression symptoms. And so I think there's a lot of variability across people, because obviously everyone's very unique and the source of their depression is very different. But it seems to be possible that people are almost permanently changed afterwards, and it can extend for a long time after. But it's very, very individual specific.
Oh, thank you.
Hi, Manesh. My name is Alex. I'm also here at Building 21, and thanks for speaking with us today. My question is about how all these notions of self and ego, they have a lot of significance in non-scientific domains, spirituality, religious beliefs, also anecdotal evidence from people who partake in psychedelics in a non-clinical setting. I was wondering how and whether in the scientific study of psychedelics you interact with those modes of describing experiences of different notions of self. How does the scientific perspective interact with these non-scientific ways of describing these similar experiences or similar perspectives?
Right. Yeah, I think there is a good deal of work looking at doing kind of more qualitative approaches of asking people and interviewing and then analyzing their responses. I think that's very common for these kinds of alterations to self. and that's fine. There's a lot of humanities literature on this. There's a lot of stuff that's not, I wouldn't call quote unquote scientific, but is approaching it in a rigorous way and trying to understand it again through structured interviews and analyzing the responses and stuff like this. And so there's a lot of that in and outside of the psychedelic space, you know, in the meditation literature and stuff, there's a lot of that and stuff too. I think it's important because, you know, if we rely exclusively on these quantitative measures, it's very specific what they look at. And we have to, you know, a priori, like predefine, this is what's important and this is what we're going to look at. And a lot of the times, you know, the questions might bias certain kinds of answers because we're expecting them to rate, you know, you give them 10 items and all the 10 items implicitly have a certain framework, then they're going to have to respond within that framework. But I think having more exploratory, qualitative interviews and stuff, which is done more and more and kind of valued more and more, is also really valuable to help inform and generate more reliable scientific measures. And so I think I see a lot of value in that myself because I see, you know, I think a lot of researchers recognize the limitations of very specific quantitative scientific measures and the need for more broader exploratory ones. So we do see a bit of both in literature.
Thank you.
I have a related question. So okay, I was wondering, like, because you were talking about some of the qualitative like data that's collected, like, do you feel that both like on the questionnaire side, like when you're writing them, and also on like just the side of like the I guess subjects that are participating in these experiments, do you feel like people are adequately equipped like linguistically to talk about these really like unique experiences, or do you feel like oftentimes in like the scientific process there's like kind of this blockage where you don't really have maybe the right words to like actually describe what's happening and for people to like relate to it on a really, I mean, specific level, I guess. I don't know if that question makes sense, but like, I guess, do you feel like you have the right words to talk about this, or is it like kind of a struggle to kind of put words on these experiences?
Yeah, I think it varies a lot from person to person. So yeah, but overall it is very difficult to capture these experiences, and people, you know, commonly say how words don't nearly do it justice, and that it's very hard to capture the complexity of what they're experiencing into a 10-minute interview or whatever, or like even longer than that, just capturing it in words. And so it is tough. People often default to words like I felt, you know, very interconnected. Connectedness is a very major theme that people often go to. But of course, you know, the typical layperson is not going to make these fine-grained distinctions between types of self or anything like that. And that's why it's kind of hard to really know what's going on in their experiences, because as you're saying, people don't have the vocabulary. And so that's why I think, you know, there needs to be close interaction between lay people and also, like, you know, ideally people who are educated in this kind of stuff and know the terminology, and having them as subjects as well would be very powerful. It goes hand in hand with this concept called neurophenomenology, which originated like, you know, around the turn of the millennium, like, you know, 2000, 1999, I think, and proposed by its researcher named Francisco Varela. And their whole idea was that, you know, subjective reports are pretty unreliable. Like, people are bad at reporting in a reliable way their internal experience, you know, and having the language to do so. And so they were like, let's depend more on long-term meditators, because they're much more aware and present with their internal experience and able to report on it. So they proposed, you know, combining really refined subjective reports from long-term meditators, people who are trained to have attention to their internal states, and combining that with neuroscience measures. And so I think a similar thing can be done here with psychedelics, is finding a cohort or, you know, demographic of people who have the language and kind of introspective access to really describe it in a way that's more nuanced and refined. And I think that's like a really important way forward to get past that impasse. And a friend of mine, Chris Timmerman, he works at Imperial College London. They just they just published a review paper advocating for neurophenomenological methods in psychedelic science and in altered states in general, which again comes back to this mixture of qualitative and quantitative reporting. and finding refined ways to describe things. So yeah, but yeah, you know, the short answer there is yeah, totally. People have trouble with it, and it's hard to come to a precise understanding beyond these kind of high level generalities a lot of the time.
Thanks.
Mhm.
I have a question. We haven't spoken much about the visual aspect or the hallucinations. And I was wondering how much of this loss of self that you experience with psychedelics comes from an actual, you know, internal physical brain change versus just us trying to grapple with a different visual scene. I don't know if that makes sense.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, empirically, it hasn't really been looked at, like how, and often the visual changes will correlate to some extent with ego dissolution experiences, but I don't think any evidence so far, or if it's even being explicitly looked at on how it might give rise to ego dissolution. I think a component of ego dissolution might be again, changes to how we perceive our body, and whether that's more somatic and proprioceptive and internal versus visual, it's unclear. But you know, when you give a higher dose of a psychedelic, you do get more visual stuff and you get more ego dissolution, but they're not perfectly correlated. They both are increased, and the mediating factor for both of them is dose, just intensity of experience. Overall goes up, they both go up. But yeah, it'd be interesting to try to see if the imagery actually gives rise to a loss of sense of self. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, it hasn't been looked at.
Thanks.
Sorry, I'm just thinking. Well, I guess we talked about visual theory, and you talked about doing questionnaires. Would you go into some other form of assessment that does not involve a verbal answer? Do you think that's possible? And how would that look like?
Yeah. Without giving a verbal answer and trying to index these sense of experiences, I think, well, one approach, which is an interesting one that, again, Robin Carhart-Harris is doing a different study, kind of similar to this, is like, even, let's say, he's not doing specifically this, but it's an idea related to what he's doing. Is like, let's say you're in a brain scanner and you're given a dose of psilocybin and you have like a joystick. And on that joystick, one of the things you might want to do is the extent to which you move it forward. Well, this is going to be messy. Yeah, I was going to say, you can say the extent to which you feel like your sense of self is being blurred or dissolved, you push the joystick forward. And then so you get a graded response, let's say, you know, from 1 to 10 at every moment in time throughout the experience. And then you see what are the brain changes correlated, you know, when you push the joystick more, what is more happening in your brain. And you don't really need to verbally report on it or anything. You just need a solid understanding of what a self alteration would be. But then it's tricky. It's tricky to measure these things because by thinking about it and having to respond, you're going to interrupt the experience as well. And so this is why people are often asked after the fact rather than during the experience. But you can easily see how messy that is, because let's say you had a 4 to 6 hour experience and then you're asked at the end, you know, how much did you experience ego dissolution? And, you know, maybe you experienced it really intensely for 5 minutes out of that 4 hours. Does that mean you're gonna give a high rating or a low rating, right? It's like, or you experienced it a little bit throughout the entire session and maybe you'll give a higher rating than if you experienced it for 10, 15 minutes intensely, right? And so it's like, it's very hard because the experience is so complex and variable. And again, having them respond during the experience might interrupt the experience. So there's a lot of tricky things that need to be figured out on how to measure these complex and variable over time experiences without disrupting them and with being kind of faithful to what's actually going on. And so these are very difficult things to solve, and I think solutions are being explored, but we certainly don't know the best way yet.
I guess also related to the visual connection with ego dissolution. Have there been, for example, studies on blind people and like they might have, I don't know what their visual hallucination might look like, but how that relates to ego dissolution?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think they've done that yet. There might be some old studies from the 50s or 60s where they might have tried something like that, but nothing contemporary with blind people. Yeah, that'd be fascinating. I have no idea. That'd be really cool to look at.
When it comes to things like asking people about like how much ego dissolution they experienced or other like alterations of self, are there indirect questions that are also sometimes used, like ways to measure someone's like dissolution, like ego dissolution or things like that, without just like directly asking them, like other, like just like any indirect questions that are used sometimes?
I'm trying to think. I think, yeah, I don't. Well, I don't think so. I mean, it's usually stuff like, that explicitly uses the word self, and then, I'm not sure what an indirect question would look like exactly. Yeah.
It's hard because like you need a really like refined like definition of self to then be able to like develop an indirect way of assessing that. So like, that makes sense. It's hard to find that kind of other angle at it when we don't even have a really good like straight on angle.
Yeah, exactly. We need to, exactly that. I think that could be interesting because then, but I think, the question there is, to what extent are people biased or going to give inaccurate answers if we're just very directly asking them? And if there's a value to indirect. One idea for an indirect that comes to mind is using different paradigms, like cognitive paradigms, to get at self-related changes. Like, for example, maybe you've heard of the rubber hand illusion, where if you, how does it go? You put your hand in a box, and then and you can't see your own hand, but you can see a rubber hand. And if they time touching your real hand with touching the rubber hand, you start to think the rubber hand is yours, because that sensory feedback you're getting. And so maybe with psychedelics, you're gonna, much more easily think that rubber hand is not yours, or is yours, and have a more sensitivity to sensations. And that's kind of an indirect way of seeing how porous or flexible your self boundaries are. So that's one thing that came to mind, but yeah. Yeah, it's interesting.
So we can induce experiences of ego dissolution through psychedelics, but is this something that can be experienced naturally as well? That's outside of like intentional meditative practice or something, day to day, I don't know.
I feel like it could. I feel like an experience where this can happen is experiences of awe. And people have actually, developed scales of awe to characterize psychedelic experience, but can also happen in nature, or, just the whole concept of the overview effect of the astronaut that was, in space and saw Earth for the first time from the external and just had that profound spiritual experience. And so I think there are ways to naturally induce these experiences where our sense of self is attenuated or kind of, made very small. And we feel connected to something greater than ourselves, and so on. And so I think these things can happen spontaneously in those kinds of awe-like experiences. And I think things like sensory deprivation, or even breath work, like really fast rhythmic breathing, can as well induce these similar experiences. So I think there are a variety of ways to get there. And an interesting question to me is like, is there only one type of ego dissolution? What is the spectrum of types of ego dissolution? Are they distinct? Is ego dissolution from breath work or, being in the Grand Canyon the same as the one with psychedelics? Like, how are they different? And these are interesting questions that we don't really know right now. But I think there are a variety of ways to induce experiences that are similar in character, you know, with psychedelics, with meditative practice, and with a whole variety of other things as well.
I have a fun question. How would a psychedelic scientist characterize a bad trip?
I think people don't like. I think scientists wouldn't call it a bad trip. We call them challenging experiences. Which is a bit of a bit of a reframing, because I mean, in the kind of the popular way of using that term, a bad trip is when you go into a negative, like fear, anxiety ridden state, and you're unable to escape it, right? And it usually will happen when you're in a very intense environment, you're at a festival or something, or you're with people you don't know too well, and you go down a negative rabbit hole and can't escape it because you're not well supported to move through it or get pulled out of it. And you know, in the research, in the clinical research and in the kind of more scientific stuff, looking at mechanisms, there's always, you know, a lot of preparation beforehand and a lot of support during the experience that's available, so people feel safe and secure. People are always told that it might be difficult, might come up, you know, you might relive difficult memories or emotions might come up, but always, you know, trust, accept, surrender, let go. And the idea is that once you're able to do that, you know, it can be very challenging and difficult, but not necessarily harmful or bad, right? It doesn't have that you can't really give it the value judgment of being good or bad. It's more like, oh, it's a hard experience, but it could still lead to positive benefits after. It could still be insightful, still be useful. And so I think how it's defined, there's actually a questionnaire called the Challenging Experiences Questionnaire, created by Fred Barrett and others at Johns Hopkins University. And there they separate a variety of dimensions, factors or dimensions of it. And like, off the top of my head, it's like there's one, it's like feelings of despair, feelings of anxiety, feelings of fear, feelings of, I think, like fear that you're gonna die, feelings of, I think, meaninglessness, and like, and so these are all transient things that can happen in an intense experience. And so, yeah, there's like formal ways that we characterize it, but again, I think scientists wouldn't say whether a trip is good or bad. It's just like, was it a bit more, did you work through some difficult material or not, kind of thing.
So in your work, you describe how there's a increased mental flexibility, I guess. This is a bit random, but how does the visual processing in psychedelic user compare to, say, a baby?
Can you repeat that? I missed the visual processing in say again, please.
Psychedelic user different from, say, how a baby visually processes the world before their visual cortex is fully developed.
Oh, like how we normally visually process the world. That's what you're asking.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. It's an interesting question. There's one. Well, I think it varies depending on the psychedelic. There was an interesting paper for DMT where they found that under DMT, with the eyes closed, the brain was processing visual information as if the eyes were open. And so it's like, you know, with DMT, people have really strong immersive experiences where they will report being in a different world and interacting with entities and beings and just really being transported somewhere else in kind of like a dreamlike vision. And like the signature of a brain activity and related to the visual cortex was basically like the eyes are open, but when their eyes were closed. And so it's fascinating because in that case, it suggests that, you know, the brain is working in the usual way. It's processing visual information. But in that case, the visual information is endogenously generated. It's generated from within. It's not coming from the senses. It's not coming from your eyes. And that's fascinating because it's like, okay, where is it coming from? And probably like from your memory and a variety of other things. And so it's like the way it kind of what's like the processing streams that allow for visual perception are being decoupled from our eyes and being linked to these internal sources of information, which is super interesting. That's with DMT, and research with LSD found that the visual cortex became much more connected to the rest of the brain than it usually is, because usually, visual processing is very specific. It's like in the visual cortex, interacts with a small set of regions. It's receiving inputs from, the thalamus, which is receiving from our optical nerve in our eyes. And in the psychedelics, that processing the visual area is now much more diffuse throughout the brain. With LSD particularly, they found this. And that was correlated with having complex imagery of like experiencing with eyes closed, like scenes and landscapes and complex dreamlike things. And so it relates to, again, the visual processing becoming less differentiated from all sorts of other information stored in our brain, whether memories, concepts, and so on.
Do you think that like self-alterations that happen during like a psychedelic experience, can they have long-term effects on like people's notion of self? Even for like, I'm even thinking of like therapeutic uses, like if you have like a therapy session where you really like reframe your mind and then you can carry that with you for like an extended time afterwards. Is there any, like, do you personally think, or is there any research about kind of long-term like changes to notion of self after psychedelic experiences?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think not specifically yet. There's that paper I mentioned earlier about negative self-beliefs and how they changed, but I don't think they've looked at really long-term effects of that yet. But I think that's a really interesting thing, because like I personally believe that those are very central to the lasting effects. Like for your depression still to be reduced after 6 months to a year, there has to be some changes in how you process, information related and how you perceive yourself. And I think those are important. That's kind of what I want to look at in my research in the future, in the coming next couple of years. But yeah, we're really early stages. There's so much here that we need to study that we haven't yet. So I think that's one of the important things we need to look at.
Someone had described how they had an out of body like type experience when they use psychedelics. So what does this third perspective look like in the brain?
Right. Yeah, I think there's other research showing that using TMS to stimulate a certain part of your brain can induce out-of-body experiences. And that certain part is your temporal-parietal junction, which is like in your parietal lobe at the junction of the temporal and parietal lobe. And it's an area that one of the main things it does is it integrates our visual information with our somatosensory information, with our sense of our body sensations and our location in space. And so we know that by stimulating that region just electrically or magnetically, you can induce those experiences. And so, and also that region of your brain has a lot of serotonin 2A receptors, which is the receptor that psychedelics hit. And so, if I were to speculate on what underlies that, it's probably a disruption of the integration of sensory signals occurring in that area, which then gives rise to this feeling of not being in the body anymore. There's a mismatch between where we feel like we were spatially located and where visually and where we really are located, right? Like our sense of that is being disrupted because the neuron populations in that area have been altered in their firing. So that's what I would think underlies that. And as I said earlier, there was a study that found that that specific region was related to ego dissolution. And I would think it's related to the bodily, aspect of it, related to that having that perspective, that first person perspective rooted in a particular location in space.
I guess it's a random question for you, personal question. How has your research impacted your concept of self for yourself?
I think how's the research? Well, I think I think in general, I've always been a big reader of Eastern spirituality and meditation and all these kinds of things. And so I think that goes hand in hand with the psychedelic stuff too, and just, you know, I guess acknowledging how our sense of self is not this concrete thing. It's actively constructed on an ongoing basis, and you know, it's full of all sorts of biases and limitations, and that we shouldn't take it too seriously. And so I feel like I live in that way where I don't, like, I'm skeptical of, you know, like thoughts that come into my head or beliefs I have about myself, and I try to hold them lightly, because again, it's kind of this thing that we're actively constructing and that is very limited, and that ultimately, you know, is in some sense, I want to say not real, but like what I mean by that is like it's not a concrete stable thing as we think it is. It's kind of a actively constructed thing in our brain that seems like it's like concrete and consistent and always there, but it's only there to the extent we give it attention and identify with it. And I think, you know, the fact that we can enter into egoless states or selfless states suggests that's not an essential part of who we are, truly, and that we can do without it. And I think that lends itself to holding those beliefs a bit lightly and not becoming over-identified with it. And I feel like I kind of, that's how I operate to some extent.
How did it affect your sense of mortality?
These are the good questions now. It's interesting. It's very interesting because I think the fear of death, in my mind, corresponds strongly to a tendency to kind of grasp and attach ourselves to our identity, and it's like, oh, we need that. Without it, like, you know, what are we going to be, and so on, having fear around losing it. And so I think it maybe reduces the fear there, and there's a lot of research even showing reduced fear of mortality with psychedelics, even in terminal cancer patients as well. And I think it is related to this of seeing that your sense of self, your identity, is not essential to your existence, and believe, you know, feeling that you're something deeper or greater than that, and that that can go away, and there might be something else beyond that. And so that rigid attachment to the body and to the identity is reduced. And so I think, yeah, it can help people better cope with their mortality. And I feel like it does that for me to some extent as well.
Thank you for your time, Manesh.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
Love with finishing up and good luck with your post-op.
Yeah,
Yeah.
beautiful research, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, thanks for inviting me, and like, great to chat. I wish I was in Montreal. I could have come hung out with you guys, but I'm not there right now. But in any case, yeah, I enjoy this. Always happy to answer these kinds of questions. And yeah, anybody's welcome to email me if you want suggestions for any papers or stuff like that. Happy to share.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cool. My pleasure. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.